Everyone in the courtroom burst out laughing. With his gavel lying languidly in his palm, Judge Raymond Harrington leaned forward. He scanned the defendant, an elderly, slender man in a wheelchair with his icy, gray eyes. Time had worn his uniform thin, but it was still nicely pressed. To those who questioned him, his medals, which had previously been emblems of honor, now appeared to be nothing more than decorations. The judge tilted his head and scoffed. "Let me clarify. Do you, as a crippled veteran, believe you can take on one of the nation's best legal teams on your own?" With their pricey clothes gleaming in the brilliant courtroom lights, the opposing attorneys grinned. William Thompson, the elderly man, sat still, his grizzled hands leaning against his wheelchair's arms. Although his face was still unreadable, his silence only served to heighten the jeering. Judge Harrington sat back in his chair and laughed. He whispered beneath his breath, loud enough for the courtroom to hear, "This should be good. Let's see what legal brilliance a man who has always carried a rifle rather than a law book may produce." The room erupted in laughter once more. People shook their heads at the ridiculousness of it all and muttered to one another. William wheeled himself forward slowly. The room's atmosphere changed. The judge looked into his hawk-sharp blue eyes. He then added, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I suggest you buckle up," in a cool yet authoritative voice. "You'll see why underestimating me was the worst decision you've ever made after I'm through here." The courtroom plunged into a thick hush. The smile subsided. The judge tensed up. The attorneys looked at each other. There was a problem. They felt as though they had just committed a grave error. 2 months ago was when the narrative really started. William watched the sun set while sitting by himself on his porch. His modest, dilapidated home was located on the outskirts of a peaceful community. His post-military life had not been kind. He shifted a little, stretching his aching arms, and his wheelchair squeaked. He had never let the fact that he had lost the use of his legs in battle to define him. He had learned that the true struggle was not fought abroad. In life itself, it was contested. On the little table next to him was a letter. It had been read a dozen times by him. He was still unable to believe it, though. A lawsuit. A case against him. His house was being threatened by a large real estate firm. They were using their wealth and power to force him away after accusing him of breaking some obscure property law. William's jaw tightened. It was more than just a house. He had nothing left but this. His wife, may she rest in peace, had spent her last days here. He had established a life here following his return from battle. Did these haughty men in suits suddenly want to take it away from him? Not when he was watching. He went to the local law office the next morning to get assistance. The lawyer shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but this case is too big for us. Their lawyers are the best in the nation." William nodded, but he was deeply disappointed. You'd need a miracle to win. He went to see another attorney, then another, and yet another. It was always the same response. Too strong, too costly, not a chance. He sat by himself on a park bench at the end of the day, gazing at the lawsuit documents he was holding. It felt heavier than ever in his wheelchair. It was then that he decided he would stand by himself if no attorney joined him. He was going to face this battle on his own. The weeks that followed were terrible. William created a war room out of his tiny living room. Every surface was covered with stacks of legal books, court case files, and notes. He read about property rights and studied, learning legal jargon every waking moment. He labored into the night, driven only by his own willpower. It was not an easy task. There were times when I was unsure and frustrated. Even though his old war wounds hurt from fatigue, he persisted. Sarah, a generous schoolteacher who lived next door, knocked on his door one evening. She looked at the jumble of papers on the table and remarked, "Mr. Thompson, you need to rest." William said, rubbing his weary eyes, "I can't." She moaned, "I lose everything if I stop now," but her eyes were full of admiration. "Then allow me to assist at least." Sarah consequently joined him in his investigation. She broke down complex legal documents in an easier-to-understand language every night. William improved his knowledge of the law with her assistance. He became stronger every day, more intelligent. He was studying more than simply the law. He was getting the hang of it. He sat looking at his image in the mirror the night before his court appearance. Not just any old soldier was staring back at him. He was more than that. He was a warrior getting ready for combat. The battlefield this time was a courtroom. The trial day finally arrived. In his uniform from the military, William rolled into the courthouse. People stared as soon as he stepped inside. Then came whispers. Does he really act as his own representative? There is no possibility for him. William, however, was unconcerned. Feeling the weight of the situation, he wheeled himself to the defendant's table. A group of accomplished attorneys in expensive suits sat across from him. Richard Sullivan, their chief lawyer, hardly acknowledged him, a smug-looking man. Judge Harrington then made his way into the courtroom. The gavel slammed. The judge said, "Let's get started." Smirking, Sullivan stood up. "We think this is a straightforward case, Your Honor. We demand that Mr. Thompson be removed from the property immediately, since he is in violation of the law." William said nothing. The man's tone was condescending, and he sensed it. The judge then faced him. "And you're going to represent yourself, Mr. Thompson?" William gave a nod. Judge Harrington smirked and leaned forward at that point. He made fun of him at that point. The whole courtroom burst out laughing at that point. At that point, William Thompson assured them that they were in for the shock of their lives with unflinching assurance. Arrogance permeated the courtroom atmosphere. The affluent attorneys, the patronizing grin of the judges, and the audience's subdued laughter. In that instant, everything shouted one indisputable truth. They were already certain that William Thompson would lose. But William had knowledge that others did not. He was aware that influence, wealth, and power were not the only factors in the legal system. It had to do with knowledge, and he had immersed himself in it for the last few months. After adjusting his wheelchair and clearing his throat, he started talking. "Before we continue, Your Honor, I would want to ask some questions of the plaintiff's attorney." Judge Harrington gave an eye roll. "This is quite unique." Disapproval. Without even trying to conceal his grin, Richard Sullivan cut in. "We can avoid wasting time on this." William didn't panic. "The question is straightforward. It shouldn't be an issue if they are so certain of their position, right?" Sullivan scowled. Judge Harrington let out a sigh. "Go ahead, but don't go on for too long." William turned to speak steadily to Sullivan. "Which statute is your client saying I'm in breach of, Mr. Sullivan?" Sullivan blinked. The inquiry was overly straightforward. Too exact. He paused. "Well, under a number of municipal and property codes." "Specifically which one?" William pushed. "Without a solid legal foundation, I doubt a lawyer of your skill would file a case. Could you provide the precise code?" Quiet. There were a few whispers among the throng. Sullivan's mouth clenched. "We can, of course. Right now, we simply don't need to get into that much depth." William grinned a little. "Yes, I believe we do." Judge Harrington moved uneasily. "This is not an interrogation, Mr. Thompson. This individual is attempting to rob me of my home, Your Honor. I have every right to inspect that the law is being accurately administered." Although he couldn't argue, the judge didn't like it. "All right, proceed." William faced Sullivan once more. "I'll ask again, Mr. Sullivan. Name the specific law that I'm breaking." Sullivan flipped through a thick binder and cleared his throat. He swiftly moved his fingers, looking for the precise section. William waited while leaning back. A few seconds went by, then a minute. The quiet grew intolerable. Sullivan gritted his teeth at last. "That information will be given later." William grinned broadly. "So you didn't know which specific legislation I allegedly broke before filing this lawsuit?" The courtroom echoed with laughter. Sullivan's cheeks became flushed. "This is absurd. We are aware, of course." "Next, say it." William cut in, his voice like a scalpel piercing the cacophony. Sullivan had nothing. He had just been exposed by William. Judge Harrington had lost the smile from his face. Angrily, he drummed his fingers on the surface. "I anticipate that by the next session, Mr. Sullivan, you'll have your legal citations prepared." Sullivan, obviously enraged, murmured beneath his breath. William didn't panic. First step, make them doubt themselves. Step 2, show that they were playing a bluff. It was now time for step 3. William turned back to the judge slowly. "If it is okay with you, Your Honor, I would like to introduce a few items." Judge Harrington's eyes narrowed. proceed, William took out a stack of papers from the folder he was holding onto his lap. He held them out and stated, "This is a record of my property deed. 25 years ago, it was legally approved, signed, and stamped." The clerk took it from him and presented it to the judge. Judge Harrington's face was unreadable as he glanced over it. William went on to say, "This is a record of every property tax payment I've made since then." And he produced another document. "Paid in full. Punctual. No infractions." They handed over another paper. Judge Harrington scowled more. Finally, with a heavier tone now, William spoke. "This is a copy of the original zoning ordinance that I allegedly broke. There's a problem, though." Sullivan moved around in his chair. "The law that's being used to force me to leave?" William paused for dramatic effect as he spoke. 3 years had passed since I had purchased my home. Throughout the courtroom, there were gasps. Sullivan's mouth tightened. Judge Harrington carefully examined the text as he turned the pages. Before striking the last blow, William allowed the silence to linger. "This implies, Your Honor, that not only is their argument without merit, but it would not have applied to me even if I had broken their purported statute. Therefore, the legislation does not operate in reverse." That day, Judge Harrington appeared shaken for the first time. Sullivan had a pallid face. The enthusiasm in the courtroom was palpable. Individuals muttered. A few people nodded. Others were muttering incredulously. Satisfied, William sat back. He had just accomplished what no one believed was possible. Using only his own knowledge, he had outwitted some of the nation's top attorneys. He wasn't finished yet, either. Sullivan jumped up before the judge could react. "I call for a recess, Your Honor." "Why?" William tilted his head in question. "So you can locate a law that is applicable?" The courtroom is still laughing. Judge Harrington rubbed his temple and moaned. "All right, tomorrow morning, we'll get together again." The courtroom suddenly emptied as he smashed his gavel. However, William heard Sullivan frantically whispering into his phone as he rolled toward the exit. He had a feeling that the battle was far from done. He was correct, because things are going to grow much worse the following morning. William arrived at the courtroom the following morning anticipating opposition. He anticipated legal ploys, protracted proceedings, and perhaps even a last-ditch fresh argument from Sullivan and his group. He was surprised to find the cops waiting for him. With their hands on their belts, 2 officers stood at the courtroom's door. As soon as he stepped inside, their gazes were fixed on him. There was a problem. One of them said, "Mr. Thompson," and moved forward. "We must talk to you outside." There was silence in the courtroom. Whispering among themselves, people turned. William scowled. "Officer, is there a problem?" The officer's mouth clenched. "Regarding your property documents, we have grounds to suspect that you have committed fraud. You must accompany us so we can question you." The crowd echoed with gasps. William maintained a neutral expression despite his racing heart. Is it fraud? The setup was clear. He glanced across at the plaintiff's table. With his arms folded and a sly smile on his face, Richard Sullivan appeared to have already won. William inhaled deeply, tried to maintain his composure. They could not frighten him because he was not a terrified old guy. "Officer, please show me any proof you have of fraud," William responded. He spoke in a steady, controlled tone. The officer paused. "Your documents were fabricated according to an anonymous report that we received. A tip from an unknown person?" William nearly burst out laughing. There was no subtlety in Sullivan's intentions. "Officer," William said. His tone was piercing. "Do you possess an arrest warrant for me?" The officer rocked uneasily. "No, sir. However, it will be better if you joined us willingly." "And if I decline?" The cop's jaw tightened. "This will then need to be escalated further." William glanced at the judge. "Will you actually let this happen, Your Honor? Yesterday, you viewed my docs. Are you implying that they are fake?" Judge Harrington rubbed his chin and leaned forward. His face was unreadable. Sullivan got to his feet. "Your Honor, I believe that this trial should be postponed until these grave accusations are looked at." William was able to see through the scheme. They had no intention of proving fraud. While he was bound up in legal jargon, they were attempting to delay the trial long enough for their corporation to evict him from his house. It was an underhanded, shady maneuver. William wasn't going to allow it to occur. Your Honor, William replied, I ask that these alleged fraud charges be reviewed immediately. I might not be able to come back until my eviction is processed if I leave this courtroom now. And I think Mr. Sullivan wants precisely that. Sullivan tensed. Disapproval. Overturned. Harrington, the judge, mumbled. In fact, the judge appeared irritated for the first time. At Sullivan, not at William. That was fascinating. Judge Harrington looked across at the policeman. I won't halt these procedures unless you have hard proof against Mr. Thompson. The policeman paused. After exchanging glances, they eventually took a step back. William remained still. He did not back down, and he prevailed. Evidently annoyed, the officers turned and walked away. William rolled his wheelchair forward, staring at Sullivan as soon as the doors closed behind them. He said it was sloppy. Sullivan's confidence finally broke, and his jaw tightened. William wasn't finished either. William went on, his voice echoing through the quiet courtroom. You came here thinking I'd be an easy target, that I'd roll over and let you take my home without a fight. What none of you anticipated, however, was that I would arrive ready. There were whispers throughout the courtroom. William bent over. Do you really think you can outmaneuver me, Mr. Sullivan? Because you're not performing well so far. Sullivan's hands smacked down on the table. This is ludicrous, Your Honor. The court is being ridiculed by this man. He was silenced when Judge Harrington held out a hand. He had an unreadable face. However, there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. The judge turned to William with a sigh before anyone could speak again. He responded, Do you have any other evidence to present, Mr. Thompson? William grinned. In actuality, Your Honor, I do. Taking out another document, he reached into his folder. An extremely significant document. This is a Supreme Court precedent that directly contradicts the plaintiff's argument, he remarked, passing it to the clerk. Shock reverberated across the courtroom. Sullivan winced. The judge, obviously fascinated, arched an eyebrow. William went on in a steady voice. This decision, however, makes it very evident that a homeowner cannot be evicted from land they lawfully acquired prior to the law's passage. Accordingly, Judge Harrington raised a hand. He carefully read the document and examined it. Then he rubbed his temple and moaned. At last, he raised his head to look at Sullivan. The judge said, Mr. Sullivan, in a weary tone, is a zoning law that was passed after Mr. Thompson purchased his property the basis for your client's case? Sullivan paused. He was confined. He was aware of his captivity. He had no choice except to tell the truth or attempt to fabricate a story in front of the whole courtroom. It was the first time he appeared anxious. The assurance, the conceit, the arrogance, it was all gone. Judge Harrington waited. The room held its breath. Finally, with his jaws clenched, Sullivan mumbled. Indeed, the courtroom was filled with gasps. Judge Harrington shook his head and let out a deep sigh. The judge murmured, Then I don't see how this case can proceed. I will analyze this precedence before we meet again. Sullivan, who appeared to have been punched in the gut, sat down hard. William, in the meantime, as everyone in the courtroom started to grasp the reality, he sat tall in his wheelchair and watched. This elderly, crippled veteran wasn't merely defending himself. He was winning, and that was not going to be taken lightly by Sullivan, because Sullivan's next action would be his most desperate one to date. As Sarah walked alongside William as he wheeled himself outside, the courthouse hallways were alive with whispers. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed when Judge Harrington postponed the case in order to consider the Supreme Court ruling. People were starting to think that William would win for the first time. William, however, was wiser. Sullivan refused to acknowledge this defeat, not without difficulty, not in silence. He was correct, because he heard a voice behind him as he got to the foot of the courthouse steps. Old man, do you believe you're smart? William halted his wheelchair. He turned slowly. At the top of the stairs, Richard Sullivan stood with his jaw clenched and his tie slightly slack. He had lost his customary arrogant self-confidence. Something uglier took its place. Desperation, anger, and frustration. Sarah moved ahead of William. Sullivan, get out of here. With a chilly laugh, Sullivan laughed. Whoa, I'm the villain. Are you aware of what you have done? He gestured toward William. One of the nation's largest real estate companies was just humiliated by you. Do you think they'll overlook that? To do as they wanted since they were powerful. He also knew how to deal with them. William wheeled himself forward slowly. He paused a few inches from Sullivan and gave him a direct look. In a low but stern voice, he said, "Let me tell you something, son. Men like you are not new to me. I have witnessed bullies who believe they are unstoppable because of their wealth. What happens to them, do you know?" Sullivan gulped, but remained silent. "They plummet," William went on, "because they misjudge the individual." Sullivan's face twitched for a second, a little fissure in his meticulously crafted mask. William leaned closer. "You are free to use any devious tactics against me, but I'm not going to stop, and you'll be the one who regrets ever entering that courtroom by the time I'm finished." Sullivan's jaw muscle stiffened. He forced a smile as he let out a sharp exhale. He murmured, "We'll see about that." After that, he turned and left, vanishing into the swarm of reporters that had gathered close to the stairs. Unaware that she was holding her breath, Sarah released it. "That man is dangerous, William." "I understand," William answered. "So why did you push him in that manner?" Turning his wheelchair, William made his way to his vehicle. "Because he and other men only know one thing: opposition. I also don't intend to give him any leeway." But even he knew in his heart, Sullivan's next action was imminent. Furthermore, it would be worse than anything he had ever attempted. William sat in his poorly lighted living room that evening. His court filings splayed on the table. Sarah sat next to him, looking through case files while drinking coffee. "All right," she said. "Thus, we are aware that their case is weak." William nodded. "We just need to wait until the judge makes a decision that's in your favor. This implies that they will attempt something outside of the courtroom." "Such as?" William took a while to respond. He had witnessed enough in his life to know that strong men turn desperate when they are forced into a difficult situation, and men in a desperate situation were dangerous. Then there was a loud thud outside. Sarah leaped. "What was that?" William rolled in the direction of the window. His keen eyes scanned the darkness as he looked out. Then he noticed it. The phrases were spray-painted over his garage door in enormous red letters. "Leave now or else." Sarah put her hand over her mouth. "God, oh God." William didn't move, his face unreadable. However, he strengthened his hold on his wheelchair's armrest. Sarah faced him. "The cops must be called." William let out a breath. "And tell them what? That some spray-wielding coward choose to intimidate me? Until anything actually occurs, they will not take any action." Sarah folded her arms. "What happens if something does occur?" William remained silent. He was not required to. The battle was far from done, and they both knew it. What about Sullivan? It had just become personal for him. William was alert and focused when he pulled into the courthouse parking lot the following morning. However, he saw something as soon as he got out of his van. Near the entryway, a small group of people had assembled. Reporters, bystanders, and even a few policemen. There was a problem. Newly arrived, Sarah rushed toward him. "You must see this, William." She gave her phone to him. A news story from an hour ago was shown on the TV. Shattering. William Thompson, a handicapped veteran, may have falsified his property deed, according to new evidence. William's heart froze. The piece went on. According to a recent review, there may be discrepancies in the documentation that Mr. Thompson gave that point to possible fraud. Authorities are investigating the case, according to those familiar with it, even though no charges have been brought. Should this turn out to be accurate, Mr. Thompson may face severe legal repercussions. William's jaw tightened. Sullivan was responsible for this. Sarah's face was white as she gazed at him. They are attempting to sway public opinion in your favor. William inhaled deeply. An attack was what he had anticipated. However, he didn't anticipate Sullivan going this far. Winning a case was no longer the only goal. Sullivan was attempting to ruin him. But the odds had been worse for William before, and Sullivan was going to find out how mistaken he was if he believed that this would intimidate him into giving in. For William was not going to back down. Not right now. Never. The courtroom was full, cameras flashing, journalists lined the back row. William was accused of forgery in an essay that quickly went viral. The entire city was now observing. Calmly, William wheeled himself to his normal place at the defense table, but he had a steely mentality. His house was no longer the only factor in this. The purpose of this was to establish the truth. Judge Harrington came in with an inscrutable look. His gavel was tapped. The court is now in session. Richard Sullivan got up before William had a chance to say anything. He was grinning again. Before we begin today's hearing, Your Honor, I must make an urgent request. Harrington let out a sigh. Proceed. With a theatrical gesture, Sullivan lifted a hefty folder. Unsettling new material that we have discovered raises doubts about the validity of Mr. Thompson's property deed. There were murmurs in the room. Journalists scrawled notes. William did not move. Harrington scowled. You're making a grave charge, Mr. Sullivan. Do you have hard proof? Sullivan flashed a wolf smile. Of course. The clerk took the folder from him and gave it to the judge. Harrington leafed through it, looking at each page. There was a tight stillness. A minute later, the judge raised his head. This is intriguing. Sullivan straightened his tie, exuding assurance. There are differences in the notary's signatures on the documents that Mr. Thompson gave. The arrangement of the stamps is not consistent. These, Your Honor, are not insignificant mistakes. These are characteristics of forgeries. The audience erupted in gasps. Incredulous, Sarah, seated in the front row, covered her mouth. William remained still. He had been training for this fight for weeks. Sullivan had just delivered his most powerful blow. Time for a retaliation. William answered, Your Honor, in a firm voice. Could I look at these alleged differences? Judge Harrington gestured for the clerk to give him the documents after giving a nod. William scanned every page slowly, looking at every detail. Then he laughed, loud enough to be heard throughout the courtroom. Sullivan's arrogance subsided a little. Mr. Thompson, something amusing? William set down the papers. Indeed, it's hilarious. He gave the judge his whole attention. Would you like to hear why this claim of forgery is complete nonsense, Your Honor? Harrington's eyebrows went up. Enlighten us, please. William bent over. The crooked stamp position? This is because when these records were digitally stored, the county office downsized and scanned them. Fraud is not the cause of the minor changes in stamp position. Standard document processing produced them. Sullivan winced. William went on. The notary's signatures, too? They are, of course, somewhat different, due to the fact that this deed has been re-recorded numerous times throughout the years. The office checked and re-stamped the original deed each time property taxes were changed or payments were made. Decades of legal maintenance are the only reason for any slight difference. Harrington turned the pages again and checked the dates. Then he gave a nod. He's correct. The courtroom was filled with gasps. Sullivan's cheeks became flushed. Nothing is proven by that. Oh, Williams said, but it does. Because the audience burst out laughing before this court wasted its time. And you would have noticed that if you truly know anything about property law, Judge Harrington appeared to be amused as well. Sullivan's mouth tightened. He faced the judge once more. Your Honor, I continue to think that a thorough inquiry is required before moving forward. Harrington rubbed his temple and moaned. Because of your lack of knowledge about fundamental document processing, Mr. Sullivan, you accused a distinguished veteran of faking his own home deed. I think we should move on unless you have concrete evidence of criminal activity. Sullivan parted his lips, then closed them. He was defeated. William sat back in his wheelchair once more, quietly observing his opponent. In court, they had attempted to break him. They had attempted to incite opposition against him. They had also failed. However, just as everything appeared to be settling down, an unforeseen event occurred. Judge Harrington gave a tapping sound. I am considering a move to dismiss since the plaintiff's claim has been seriously undermined. Quiet. The case would be completely dismissed in the event of a request to dismiss. Sullivan got up quickly. Disapproval. To examine these statements, we require time. William's gaze grew strained. Sullivan was taking his time. Then it dawned on him. Winning in court was no longer important to Sullivan. All he needed was time. However, why? Then his phone buzzed in his pocket as though to respond to his query. Sarah whispered as she leaned forward. It's bad, William. She gave her phone to him. His stomach fell. A breaking news notice was sent out. The judge tries to dismiss the disabled veteran's complaint. Thompson's house is currently being demolished in the meantime. William's face drained of blood. His home, his house. They had no intention of waiting for a court decision. It was being taken against their will. And at this very moment, they were doing it. William's heart thumping. He clutched the wheels of his wheelchair. And he whispered, "Sullivan." His voice was cold. Sullivan grinned. "Oh, what's wrong?" William balled his hands into fists. The courtroom was no longer the scene of the struggle. It was taking place outdoors. And they were going to find out how mistaken they were if they believed he was just to sit there and let them ruin everything he had left. William wasted no time at all. He pushed his wheelchair around and headed for the exit as quickly as he could, without waiting for the judge's decision. Sarah was battling to keep up with him, just behind him. "Slow down, William. No time." His tone was urgent and aggressive. In his chest, his heart thumped. His house, his whole existence, was in danger of going extinct. And at that time, he was confined to a courthouse. Reporters flocked to the courthouse as soon as they stepped through the doors. "Do you have an answer to the accusations, Mr. Thompson? What are your thoughts on the potential dismissal of your case? Are you aware that the demolition of your home has already begun?" That final query was like a bullet. William's head jerked in the direction of the reporter. "What?" The man displayed a live video clip on his phone. Although the video was grainy, it was still visible. A bulldozer, a gang that wrecks things. Suit-wearing people viewing from a distance. His home, his front porch, and his wife's favorite rose bushes. The location where he had rebuilt his life for years. Half of it was gone already. William's eyes turned crimson. No, no, no. He rolled in the direction of the parking lot, pushing harder. Sarah rushed forward and yanked open William's van's passenger door. "Hurry up. We're still able to make it." William's hands moved on adrenaline as he wheeled up the ramp. Sarah floored it as soon as he stepped inside. If William wasn't already furious, the van's speed as it swerved through traffic and screamed onto the street would have given him a heart attack. Sarah's knuckles were white as she held onto the wheel. "This is against the law, William. While the lawsuit is still pending, they are unable to do this." William's mouth tightened. "They're indifferent. Sullivan is using this ruse to get rid of me before the law finds him, because he knows he won't prevail in court." Sarah tightened her jaw. "Then we will first catch up with him." The van sped down the road, getting closer to William's residence. But the sinking sensation in his stomach grew worse the closer they neared. This was no longer just about a house. Justice was at issue here, and there was a payer on the horizon. When they arrived in his neighborhood, the devastation had already begun. This was obviously prearranged because a huge construction truck blocked a portion of the road. What was left of the porch was being torn down by neon-vested workers. The bulldozer stood menacingly close to his home's last remaining wall. Richard Sullivan was standing off to the side, looking incredibly arrogant in his high-end suit. Something snapped inside William the moment he saw him. Sarah applied the brakes firmly. "Here we are. We must put an end to them." William didn't hold back, fury driving him. He threw open the van door and rolled himself out. "Give up." Over the sound of equipment, his voice thundered. People turned. The employees paused, unsure. The bulldozer operator raised his hand to indicate that the team should stop. Sullivan turned at that point. He grinned. With his hands in his pockets, he said, "Ah, Mr. Thompson, you're in time to witness the making of history." William stopped only inches from him as he rolled up to meet him. Sullivan laughed. "You must have heard the news, right?" William spoke in a low, lethal voice. "You're not authorized by law to do this." Sullivan took a piece of paper out of his pocket and remarked, "Oh, but I do. Due to urgent safety issues, this demolition order is an emergency. I tugged at a couple of strings. It turns out that your house needs to be taken down for public safety since it is extremely unstable." William gripped his wheels tighter. "You're lying," shrugged Sullivan. "Perhaps. Perhaps not. However," he pointed to the wreckage when someone contested it in court. "Oh, it's too late." Sarah rushed forward. "This is not possible." Sullivan grinned. "The case hasn't even been settled." "Yes, I believe it has." Then he waved his hand toward the bulldozer operator. "Complete the task." The engine sprang to life with a roar. Before William's brain moved, his body did. He threw himself forward out of reflex and rolled straight into the bulldozer's path. The audience let out a gasp. With its enormous blade only a few feet away from William's chair, the bulldozer screamed to a stop. People began to shout, "What is he doing? Get him to go." William remained still. The machine was right in front of his wheelchair. Thousands of pounds of steel against one man. The driver paused, surveying the area. "Well, sir?" Sullivan's expression grew gloomy. "For what reason are you waiting? Get him to move." However, the employees paused, because a change had occurred. People were observing, neighbors as well as reporters. Passers-by, people who had known William for years in this town. And he was battling for more than just his house at the moment. He was battling for a greater cause. Something was beginning to move. An opposition to corruption. Sullivan was aware of it. William's voice echoed, firm and unyielding. "I call this place home." Sullivan's hand clenched. "And I will not let you take it from me." He glanced at the driver of the bulldozer. "Proceed." The driver paused. Then he switched the engine off. Anger twisted Sullivan's face. "What are you doing?" The driver used his vest to clean his hands. "I didn't sign up to ruin him for some wealthy lawyer. I signed up to create houses." Cheers broke out from the throng. A group of neighbors began to approach William. Sarah faced the press. "I take it you're getting all of this?" Cameras flashed. Sullivan was becoming unmanageable. Desperately, he turned to find assistance. But something happened as soon as he did. A police vehicle arrived, then another, and yet another. Judge Harrington exited the front automobile with an angry look on his face. "Sullivan," the judge yelled, "I just finished speaking with the county commissioner on the phone. It is unlawful to demolish a building." Sullivan went pallid. "Yes, it isn't. I looked over the case of Thompson." Harrington went on. "He is not subject to the zoning regulations. Additionally, you, Mr. Sullivan, are being investigated for submitting a false emergency demolition order." Another gasp. "Next, take him into custody." Officers moved quickly. "Hold on. You can't." Sullivan's objections were interrupted when the cold steel of the shackles clicked into place and his hands were dragged behind his back. The audience applauded. William closed his eyes and allowed the moment to pass. He was victorious. At last, he had prevailed. Sarah smiled as she knelt down to William's chair as Sullivan was pulled away. "You succeeded." William let out a breath. "No." He turned to face the individuals behind him. "We succeeded." And he felt really at home for the first time in a long time. When William eventually wheeled himself onto what was remained of his front yard, the sun had just started to set, streaking orange and purple over the sky. His house had barely survived. The walls were half gone. Debris from the combat he had just waged covered the ground like scars, and the roof collapsed on one side. It was still his home, though. A minor triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. Sarah sat on the front stairs next to him, or the remnants of them. She shook her head. "I still find it hard to believe. In fact, while we were still in court, they were attempting to destroy it." William wiped his face and let out a sigh. Legal victory was never Sullivan's goal. All he wanted was for me to go before the cops caught up with him. Sarah scowled. "Well, it quickly caught up." William grinned. "Yes, it did. He will now be held accountable for all of the deception, fraud, and unlawful demolition effort." Even while he wanted to celebrate the win, he realized that the fight was far from done, because the real estate company was still in business even though Sullivan was temporarily out of it, and he had a feeling they weren't finished yet. William awoke the following morning to a sound he recognized. The door was knocked on, not his front door, which was largely in ruins. However, he was able to stay in a makeshift trailer that one of his neighbors had lent him while the repairs were being made. A man in a dark suit was standing there with a briefcase when he opened it. "Mr. Thompson?" William looked at him suspiciously. "It depends." Who was inquiring? Though it fell short of his eyes, the man grinned. "Charles Whitmore is my name. Bright Future Developments is what I stand for. The business where Mr. Sullivan was employed." William gripped his wheelchair more firmly. "Let's get started." Whitmore straightened his necktie. "Could I enter?" "No." The man paused, then got back up fast. "Okay then, I'll keep it short. My business sincerely apologizes for yesterday's regrettable incident." William gave a snort. "These days, is it what you term attempted destruction of private property and fraud?" Whitmore didn't pay attention to the remark. "We want to present you with an offer." William's eyes narrowed. Whitmore took a contract out of his briefcase and put on a clipboard. $500,000. The number was like a slap to William. Another filthy tactic was what he had anticipated. One more legal ploy. Not like this. The paper was tapped by Whitmore. $500,000. In money. "You simply need to sign this agreement, turn in the deed, and leave. No legal action. Nothing more. You'll be able to purchase a new home. Anywhere you like. Perhaps even a new beginning." William gazed at the agreement. It was alluring. He was not wealthy. That sum of money would change your life. At last, he could afford high-quality medical care. He may relocate to a new, simpler location. Somewhere he hadn't recently fought a war and that wasn't still standing on the battlefield. Then he turned to face his country, his house, his recollections, and he recalled why he had initially put up such a fierce fight. It had nothing to do with money. This had to do with principle. His voice was firm as he turned back to Whitmore. "I have a question for you. Why are you so keen to purchase my house now, if it is such an issue for your business?" Whitmore took a while to respond. His facade of civility faltered slightly. William grinned. "I had that thought." He redirected the clipboard in Whitmore's direction. "Accept your offer and leave." With a sigh, Whitmore seemed to be addressing a child who was obstinate. "Let's not be crazy, Mr. Thompson. This is the best deal you will find." William bent over. "Do you not understand? The money was never the main focus. It has to do with fairness. Furthermore, I don't think your business will act in an honest or fair manner. I'm not selling, so no. Leave my land now." It was the first time Whitmore's courteous manner broke. His gaze grew gloomy. "You're doing something wrong." William remained still. "No, you did, when you believed that I would give up." Tucking the contract back into his briefcase, Whitmore turned on his heel and pursed his lips. But he looked back before he went. "You ought to give it some thought, Mr. Thompson," he added. His tone was foreboding. "Because this battle is far from ended, I assure you." Then he turned to leave. William had one gut feeling as he watched him leave. This was hardly a sacrifice for peace. It was dangerous. Sarah virtually vibrated with rage as she marched into the trailer hours later. "Were they?" William poured himself a cup of coffee and stated, "They tried to buy me out." "And you refused?" William looked at her sharply. With a sigh, Sarah raised her hands in the air. "I understand your conflict, William, but $500,000? That's money that can change your life." After taking a slow sip, William put the cup down. "I have a question for you, Sarah." She folded her arms. "What? Would you allow someone to pay you to forget about what they stole from you?" She paused. He continued, "Would you allow them to escape punishment, being aware that they would simply harm someone else?" She rubbed her temples and moaned. "Don't you have to make a point all the time?" He grinned. "It's among my strongest traits." Sarah sat down opposite him and shook her head. "William, I don't want them to harm you. People like this don't play fairly. I am aware." "What comes next?" William let out a breath. "We defend ourselves. Lawfully." Sarah scowled. "How?" Taking a folder from the table, he pushed it in her direction. Her eyes grew wide when she opened it. "Hold on a minute. Is this—" William gave a nod. "A lawsuit in class action?" Sarah blinked. "You no longer only battle for your house. Not at all. You're bringing down the entire business." William's eyes were hard. They overpowered me. He inhaled deeply. It's their turn to feel fear now. And he wasn't merely defending for the first time. He was attacking. William arrived to Patterson and Green, a tiny but well-known law practice in the city, early the following morning. He had been collecting all of his proof for the past 12 hours. Documentation demonstrating false allegations against him, court transcripts, public records, and, above all, the emergency demolition order that lacked legal justification. He no longer fought only for himself. He was getting ready to bring down promising advances in the future. A young receptionist was astonished to see an older man in a wheelchair glide in with a heavy binder on his lap as she looked up from her desk. "What can I do for you, sir?" With grace, she inquired. William gave a nod. "I must consult with your top class action lawyer." She paused. "Have you got a scheduled appointment?" "No," he responded. "However, I have a better idea. I may have a case that changes the course of history." unsure of how to react. The woman blinked until a voice spoke up behind her. "Class action, did you say?" A tall, well-dressed man in a navy blue suit came over. He had the assurance that only came from winning high-stakes cases, and he appeared to be in his early 40s. William assessed him right away. "He played to win, this man." "You are too?" William inquired. "Michael Patterson," he said, holding out his hand. "Senior partner, you have my attention, but I don't accept walk-ins." William wasted no time. He gave the binder to him. "It has all the information you require. You name it: harassment, property theft, fraud, unlawful demolitions, etc. Furthermore, I'm not simply attracted to promising future advances. Hundreds have been subjected to it." Michael looked at the pages as he turned the pages of the binder. His brows furrowed more and more as he read. Then he raised his head. "Do you wish to sue them in a class action lawsuit?" "Yes, exactly." Michael let out a breath. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Thompson. Such a case is enormous. Years may pass. It's costly, intricate, and—" William interrupted him. "Mr. Patterson, are you a believer in justice?" Michael blinked. "Since I do," William went on, "I've spent my entire life fighting for it. And I'm not going to quit now. Despite my lack of wealth, I possess the truth. I have proof, and the entire community is prepared to support me. So are you in or out? That's the only question." Michael looked at him. A smile slowly appeared on his lips. "Let's eliminate them." A week later, the case was formally filed. News quickly spread. A disabled veteran spearheads the legal battle against the dishonest real estate tycoon. Against promising future advances, a class action lawsuit was brought. The judge gives the lawsuit permission to move forward. The company is facing a significant legal battle. It was all over. William wasn't by himself, either. Dozens of additional victims came forward in a matter of days. People who have been bullied, threatened, and evicted from their houses due to corporate greed include elderly homeowners, single parents, veterans, and others. The movement expanded, and, promising advancements in the future, panic was beginning to set in. William took a seat in his makeshift trailer. Sarah reads out loud the most recent headlines. She shook her head and remarked, "This is crazy." The case is being joined by people from all throughout the state. William took a drink of coffee. "Excellent. The more, the better. Shada bent over." William, however, "They're not going to take this lying down, are they?" "I am aware. They will strike back." "I am aware." She let out a breath. "What will we do next?" William grinned. "We cause them to perspire." He produced a list of business sponsors financing promising future initiatives from a folder. Sarah's gaze expanded. William gave the paper a tap. "Ethics are unimportant to these businesses. Money is important to them, and they will begin to withdraw out if we apply enough pressure." Sarah smiled. "They will become bankrupt before the trial even begins because of you." William's eyes shone brightly. "That's the strategy." It took 3 days for the first sponsor to withdraw, then another, and yet another. Pressure from the public increased. Consumers boycotted the company's affiliated stores. Outside their headquarters, protests gathered. The stock of promising future developments fell precipitously. Just when they thought things couldn't get much worse, a whistleblower stepped forward. A former worker, and everything was altered by what he disclosed. Daniel Reeves was the whistleblower. Daniel was a mid-level worker at Bright Future Developments who had spent more than 6 years in the legal compliance division. He had witnessed everything: the unlawful demolition orders, the shady transactions with dishonest city officials, and the fraudulent land purchases. He was now prepared to speak. Late in the evening, the news was released. Exclusive. A former employee of Bright Future exposes business malfeasance. A startling fraud plot is revealed via secret documents. An internal leak exposing the company's illegal behavior gives the veteran's claim fresh impetus. As the news anchor delivered the report, William sat in his trailer and stared at the TV screen. In order to unlawfully take land for upscale commercial projects, Bright Future Developments bribed municipal officials, fabricated zoning records, and purposefully misrepresented property assessments, according to papers disclosed by whistleblower Daniel Reeves. Additionally, The documents attest to the company's hasty demolition of William Thompson's house in order to evade legal examination. Sarah was sitting next to him and almost dropped her coffee, even though she knew their case had no legal standing. William, this is enormous. William remained silent. His thoughts were already racing. His house was no longer the only factor in this. The goal was to expose everything. Within minutes, their lead lawyer, Michael Patterson, called. "Did you see the news?" "I saw," William said. "And you're probably thinking the same thing I am." "Oh," Michael said, "I am." The case is now open and closed after a difficult legal battle. We have criminal charges in addition to a lawsuit if these documents are authentic. William's mouth clenched, though he gave him a hefty blow. Michael made no hesitation. "Let me have 2 days. I'll be prepared with a plan." William let out a breath. They knew the truth. They simply needed to use it now. Leonard Grant, the CEO of Bright Future Developments, gave a press conference the following morning. With cameras flashing all around him, he stood rigidly at the podium. His lips formed a forced, phony smile. "I would like to reassure the public that our business has always operated legally. These current accusations are only an effort to damage our brand." William watched the live transmission with a sneer. "Falsehoods. All falsehoods." Then one of the reporters held up a hand. "Why did Daniel Reeves give internal emails demonstrating explicit directives to fabricate zoning reports, Mr. Grant, if your company is innocent?" The chief executive's smile wavered. Another reporter went right in. "What about William Thompson's house being demolished? It was accepted under fraudulent circumstances, according to the records. Do you refute that?" Grant's forehead began to perspire. "Well, these claims are still being investigated, as I mentioned. You've directly approved unlawful land seizures. Isn't that right?" Another reporter cut in. Grant's face went white. The journalist caught a whiff of blood. "William, too?" He grinned, because they were on defense for the first time. By day's end, the FBI had opened a formal inquiry. The corporate headquarters of Bright Futures were seized by federal officials. Hard disks, internal communications, and boxes containing classified material were confiscated. In an instant, the walls began to close in. William sat outside that night and gazed at the ruins of his house. Sarah wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat beside him. "William, you succeeded." He gave a head shake. "Not quite yet." She scowled. "What are you saying?" He let out a sigh. "These businesses don't simply disappear. They quarrel. They pause. If they can, they postpone trials for years." Sarah gave him a look. "What then do we do?" William inhaled deeply. "We end this," he stated quietly and resolutely. "For good and all." He took his phone out and made one last call. William made a call that evening to a name that very few people in the nation actually feared. U.S. Rebecca Monroe, Attorney General. The Iron Prosecutor was her nickname. Brutal. Wonderful. A lady who had overthrown millionaire scammers, corrupt corporations, and even certain politicians who believed they were beyond the law. And now, she was going to aim for promising future advancements. Her voice was professional and piercing when she responded. "Thompson, mister. I was anticipating your call." William gripped his phone tighter as he reclined back in his wheelchair. "Have you seen the reports, I presume?" "Yes, I have." There was a brief silence. "And I'll tell you the truth, Mr. Thompson. I'm completely focused on this case." William only needed to hear that. Federal indictments were revealed the following morning. Deception, conspiracy, racketeering, destruction of private property. Leonard Grant, the CEO, was formally charged. The revelation of covert bank transactions by whistleblower Daniel Reeves, however, was the actual shock. Bribes of millions of dollars were given to judges, zoning boards, and city authorities. The case has grown beyond its size. It was a historic event, and promising advancements in the future, they were done. William showed up in the courts that afternoon for what was to be another hearing on his lawsuit. Rather, it turned into the last nail in the coffin. Judge Harrington walked in, looking worn out. With a heavy sigh, he adjusted his glasses. "I take it that all parties are informed of the case's developments?" Still out on bond, Sullivan appeared to have gone days without sleep. His immaculate suit was rumpled. He had a pallid face. William's lawyer, Michael Patterson, stood smugly next to him. Your Honor, indeed. Judge Harrington gave a nod. So let's avoid wasting time. He looked across at Sullivan. Does this lawsuit still want to be contested in light of promising future developments? Sullivan began to shift uneasily. Your Honor, my client is reconsidering their position in light of the current situation. What does it mean? Harrington pushed. Sullivan let out a defeated sigh. In other words, we're ready to make a compromise. Throughout the courtroom, there were gasps. William's mouth formed a hard line. He was victorious. It wasn't quite over, though. Michael Patterson cleared his throat. Although we are grateful for the settlement offer, Mr. Thompson has one requirement, Your Honor. Judge Harrington's eyebrows went up. What is that, too? Michael looked across at Sullivan. And let the hammer fall. We want this settlement to encompass all victims who have been scammed by bright future developments. All homeowners, all families, all veterans, everyone who was forcibly relocated by this business. Sullivan's mouth clenched. That isn't feasible. Michael grinned. We'll see you in federal court after that. Quiet. Judge Harrington gave Sullivan a look. Okay, Mr. Sullivan. Sullivan took a deep breath. Then he nodded slowly. All right. Whispers swept through the room. For a minute, William closed his eyes. It was done. Not only for him, either. For all those they had harmed. Bright future developments formally fell apart a few days later. They had their assets frozen. Criminal charges were brought against their senior executives. What about William? He was given complete ownership of his property. However, that wasn't the true triumph. Justice was the true winner. Not for him alone, but for each individual they had attempted to ruin. William waited outside the ruins of his house that night as the sun went down. Sarah at his side. His former home has vanished. However, a fresh development was starting. A community was forming. Neighbors, volunteers, even unidentified people. Everyone was eager to assist in restoring what had been stolen from him. Sarah pushed him. What comes next, then? With a gentle smile, William let out a breath. He said plainly, we reconstruct. And now, it would not be taken away from him. William felt something he hadn't felt in a long time when he woke up the morning following the final court decision. Calm. His life had been a battleground for months. Battling against dishonest businesses, shady attorneys, and a legal system that had been skewed against the wealthy. Now, though, he had one now. He wasn't alone either. It was being referred to as one of the largest corporate takeovers in recent history by news outlets across. An invalid veteran exposes a multi-million-dollar real estate swindle. Bright Future Development's top executives were indicted by the FBI in a landmark class action settlement. Thousands of victims will get compensation. It had been a huge settlement. Every individual that Bright Future Developments had illegally evicted had to receive compensation. At last, families who had been forced from their homes were receiving the justice they were due. What about William's house? There was already a reconstruction project under progress. William arrived at the building site that afternoon. However, this was no ordinary building site. It belonged to him. And now, volunteers were everywhere. People who had heard his story and wanted to help included neighbors, veterans, and even total strangers. Sarah had already arrived and was leading a team of workers as they unloaded supplies. She gestured for him to come closer. You're right on time, William. She gave a call. William swung over. Are you sure you have this many people coming? Sarah grinned. Are you serious? People enjoy a good story about the underdog. You become something of a hometown hero. William laughed. Well, I think I'll be fine as long as they don't ask for signatures. He looked around, absorbing everything. The ruins of his former house had been wiped out entirely. And where did it go? The starting point for something new. Something more powerful. A new house. Sarah pushed him. Are you prepared for this? Exhaling, William gazed at the land before him. I've always been prepared. Some of William's busiest weeks were those that followed. Despite being confined to a wheelchair, he continued to work. He oversaw groups, arranged materials, and even devoted hours to instructing younger volunteers in the fundamentals of construction. It was his old military discipline. He managed the project as if it were his mission. And gradually, the house began to take shape. It wasn't only his house, though. There was more going on. He was taking a break from monitoring one afternoon when a young couple came up to him. Mr. Thompson? Shyly, the woman said, "We simply wanted to express our gratitude. We were among the families that bright future developments expelled. We are now regaining our home as a result of your action." William grinned broadly. "I don't need your gratitude. All you need to do is make me a promise." The husband gave an enthusiastic nod. "Anything." William's face became grave. "Stand up for others if you ever witness them being treated the same way we were. Nobody should have to fight by themselves." The pair nodded, determination shining in their eyes. At that moment, William came to a realization. His house was no longer the only factor in this. There was a movement involved. His residence was completed in 3 months. The neighborhood had come together to celebrate. The sun was shining and the air was crisp. Across the front porch was a huge banner. "William, welcome home." Sarah shook her head as she stood beside him. "It still amazes me that we succeeded." William laughed. "Do you ever question me?" Sarah grinned. "Not even a moment." His attorney, Michael Patterson, came forward. "I believe it's time for the last phase, Mr. Thompson." He displayed the action. "Signed. Sealed. Untouchable, absolutely. You own this house, William. Forever. No ups. No legal gimmicks. It won't ever be taken from you again." William ran his fingertips over the parchment as he accepted the deed. He had battled for this moment for a long time, and now he possessed one. For himself, for his neighborhood, for everyone who had ever been told they lacked the strength to challenge the system. The back of his eyes were burning with tears. He wouldn't let them go, though. Rather, he turned and grinned at the audience. "Well," he said in a firm voice, "does anyone? You want to have a housewarming party?" Cheers broke out from the throng. Laughter. Festivity. Because of William Thompson, he was not merely at home. At last he was free. The celebration continued long into the night. William's new home was crowded with volunteers, friends, and neighbors, laughing, telling tales, and commemorating a fresh start as well as a triumph. Under the string lights, kids ran through the yard, chasing one another. Sitting on the porch, veterans from William's former regiment shared stories about their experiences in the military. Even several of the journalists who had reported on his case came to see the conclusion of a story that had motivated a whole nation, but not to ask questions. William, too. He watched it all happen from his wheelchair by the porch. It was for this that he had battled. A home, not merely a house with 4 walls and a roof. A location where everyone was standing together. Where the concept of justice was an action rather than merely a word. Sarah took a seat next to him and gave him a freshly brewed cup of coffee. "How does it feel, hero?" William shook his head and laughed. "I believe that I am too old to be referred to as a hero." Sarah grinned. "Come on, please." The same folks who earlier believed he would rebuild his home after a crippled veteran exposes one of the nation's largest business scams? It sounds like a scene from a movie. William looked up at the stars and let out a breath. "Sarah, it was never about me." She pushed him. "Perhaps not. However, you offered people hope." William gave a slight smile. "I hope. Yes. Fighting for that was worthwhile." As the evening wore on, individuals began to depart, giving William hugs and expressions of gratitude before they left. Among the last to leave was Michael Patterson. With a rare display of adoration in his normally harsh face, he shook William's hand. "This case changed a lot of things," Michael stated. William's eyebrow went up. "In what way?" Michael folded his arms. "The FBI inquiry is still ongoing. To start, every corrupt official connected to promising future developments is being targeted. There are already some legislators quitting. Some are preparing for trials." William grinned. "Excellent." Michael gave a nod. "What about that class action lawsuit?" It established a standard. Companies now have a difficult time doing these tactics without suffering major repercussions. "William, you didn't simply win. The system was altered by you." William breathed out slowly. The victory was greater than he could have ever dreamed. Michael gave him a shoulder clap. "William, be careful. Patterson, you too." Michael then departed, leaving William alone himself on the porch. It was silent for the first time in a long time. The battle was over. They had won the battle. William, too? He let himself just be for the first time in years. With coffee in hand, he wheeled himself onto his porch the following morning. Observing the land he had battled so hard to save as the sun rose. It was more than a house. It was home. Sarah approached with a newspaper in her hand. Guess who once again made the main page? William moaned. "Oh, for heaven's sake." Sarah waved the paper in laughter. "Calm down. This time it's an excellent one." The man who stood his ground was the headline. How a veteran with a disability won against corporate America. A photo of him beneath it, seated in front of his just-constructed home. A resolute smile on his lips. Sarah smiled. What will happen to William Thompson next? William sipped his coffee slowly. Then he grinned as he peered out toward the horizon. I'll probably just enjoy being at home. Then he rolled his wheelchair inside, turned it, and shut the door. The battle was over. Justice was done, and it really was the end for William Thompson.